1983, a 747 flew high above the Pacific with almost 300 people on board. Korean Airlines Flight 007 was nearing the end of its journey from New York to Seoul. But it had wandered off course, hundreds of kilometers to the west, into Soviet airspace. The flight crew were oblivious. But Soviet Defense Command was on high alert. Sensitive military bases lay below. Fighters were ordered into the air to observe, then to fire warning shots, then to destroy the unresponsive intruder. The world was stunned by the tragic loss of life. What had gone wrong? Who was at fault? We'll use 21st century forensic technology to reinvestigate this controversial event and hear from the Soviet fighter pilot who shot the Korean airliner out of the sky. On Unsolved History. The 1st of September 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007, with 269 people aboard, was shot down by a Soviet fighter plane. No one on board survived. 23 of the dead were children under the age of 12. The incident sparked outrage around the world. The United States charged that the Soviets had fired upon a defenseless civilian aeroplane without provocation.
There was absolutely no justification, either legal or moral, for what the Soviets did.
The Soviet Union countered that the 747 was actually a spy plane and that their actions were justified.
The Soviet regime, to the end of its days, insisted the mission had been a spy flight. They hid away the data, the recorders that they had discovered, and their own internal reports on the behavior of their air defense forces.
Many mysteries about this disaster remain to this day. No one knows why the Korean jumbo jet was so far off course. It had strayed over Soviet territory. But was it in Soviet airspace when it was shot down? How could a Soviet fighter pilot have mistaken a commercial 747 for a spy plane? And why was so little wreckage found? To help answer these questions, Unsolved History has assembled a team of investigators and experts. Historian Daniel Martinez. Retired aviation investigator Ron Schleed. Author and former NASA engineer Jim Oberg. Retired 747 pilot Hal Ewing. Russian aviation investigator Vladimir Kofman. Former Soviet Air Force General Anatoly Kornikov. And Russian journalist Andrei Ilyich. Also, we'll hear a moment-by-moment account of the tragedy by the man who actually shot down KAL 007, fighter pilot Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Osipovich. In 1983, tensions between the United States and the USSR were high. American President Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union the evil empire 5 months earlier, and the superpowers were engaged in a dangerous game of brinksmanship. On September the 1st, the game turned deadly. After stopping to refuel, Korean Airlines Flight 007 departed Anchorage, Alaska at 4 a.m. It was the second leg of its flight from New York to Seoul. The shortest route would have taken the jet over Soviet territory. The Cold War tensions were high, so commercial airliners routinely stayed outside the borders of the USSR. 10 minutes after leaving Anchorage, KAL 007 started drifting off course. 1 hour and 20 minutes later, the plane was no longer in contact with Alaska's air traffic control, and even further off its flight path. It was heading straight for the Kamchatka Peninsula and out of range of any of the North Pacific radio beacons. KAL 007 had missed its last American checkpoint at Bethel, Alaska.
After it passed Bethel, which it missed by only 12 miles, not really enough to give the radar controllers, even had they been watching, much of a heads up, there are no more beacons on the entire North Pacific route until you get to Japan.
The Kamchatka Peninsula was home to several key Soviet military installations. As the Korean airliner approached Kamchatka, Soviet air defense ordered fighter jets to approach and observe it. 32 minutes later, Flight 007 had crossed the peninsula and re-entered international airspace. Soviet air defense tracked the plane as it continued on a southwest heading. Apparently unaware that they were off course, KAL 007's cockpit crew continued to make weather and progress reports to air traffic controllers in both Anchorage and Tokyo.
The passengers on that airplane, even the crew, in all probability weren't even aware that they had ever violated Soviet airspace.
Soon, 007 approached Sakhalin Island, where once again it would enter Soviet airspace. Soviet Defense Command ordered MiG-23 and Su-15 interceptors into the air. For 20 minutes, the fighters shadowed the Korean 747.
The Soviets had launched aircraft out to meet the intruder, came around behind it, and followed it across the island.
At 6:15 p.m. local time, the 747 pilot requested permission to climb to 10,700 meters. 3 minutes after that, Su-15 pilot Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Osipovich received orders to destroy the aircraft. Osipovich fired his 2 missiles, each bearing 32 kilos of high explosives, and reported to ground control that the target was destroyed. It took 12 minutes for the crippled aeroplane to spiral 10,700 meters to Earth. KAL 007 crashed into the Sea of Okhotsk, just north of Monoran Island, 350 nautical miles off course. Why had the plane strayed so far off its flight path? The Korean pilot and crew were very experienced, and they'd flown the Anchorage to Seoul route many times before.
How could they fly like this? How could an experienced pilot really ignore his navigation? This remains a mystery.
Lawyer Juanita Madola represented the families of the victims of KAL 007.
The claim was negligence on the part of the cockpit crew, that they had devices in the cockpit that would have let them know that they were off course in terms of coordinates, and also that they were over land when they should have been over water. So our argument was that they were totally oblivious to where they were and didn't care, or they knew that they were off course but were trying to fumble their way across the Pacific anyway.
To try and get some insight into the matter, retired 747 pilot Hal Ewing and historian Daniel Martinez have come to the Flight Training Academy in Miami, Florida. Ewing has been studying the crash of KAL 007 for over 20 years. Using combined data from the black boxes and a 1993 report by the International Civil Aviation Organization, he will mimic the flight of KAL 007 in a state-of-the-art flight simulator, from the time it took off until it crashed into the sea.
And make the same turns that they made at the same time that they made. The simulator here has been set to the same weight, the same center of gravity, the same weather conditions, and trim is the same. To the maximum of our ability, everything is the same as it was that night.
Okay.
Like most commercial airliners at the time, the 747 depended upon an inertial navigation system, or INS. This guided the plane, using a series of ground-based radio beacons.
The route the aircraft was supposed to fly was R20, which is an airway. And R20 has certain waypoints along the way that are entered in to the inertial navigation system. And the inertial navigation system, when it's linked to the autopilot, will then fly the aircraft to each of these waypoints.
But this system wasn't automatic. The pilot needed to switch the aircraft to the INS mode manually.
When it reached a certain location, the autopilot should have been linked to the inertial navigation system, which would have taken the aircraft on a route that would have kept it out of Soviet airspace.
But on the 1st of September 1983, the INS was not engaged.
For some reason, the switch was in all probability never moved from heading to INS to actually engage the INS system. Clearly, something distracted them at the crucial moment, caused them to simply forget to move the switch from heading to INS, and then they never caught the error for the remaining 5 hours of flight. One of the central questions that the general public has had about this incident since it happened is, how could someone not have seen what was going on? Why didn't ground control see that the flight was off course? Why didn't somebody warn KL-007 that it was about to stray into the Soviet Union? The answer is right here. These are all the sites that existed in 1983 that could have seen Korean Air 007 on radar as it headed off to the west toward Seoul. It began to deviate from its desired track almost immediately after takeoff. A direct track from where it was at that moment to Bethel is not depicted on the chart, and it's not depicted on the radar scope of the controller. So there was really no way for the controller to know whether the flight was proceeding at any given moment direct to Bethel or not, simply by looking at his radar scope.
Now, we have radars, even at that time, that could reach out thousands of miles in space and track an object. Why couldn't that track KAL?
The problem is they're usually large, very powerful phased array radars, and they're designed to look at space. They're not designed to look at things close to the surface of the Earth. So because of their antenna position and because of the fact that the Earth is round, KL-007 was simply underneath their radar horizon almost all the time. Now, as you can see from the chart here, when KL-007 started getting seriously off course and beginning to penetrate Soviet airspace way over here,
it's out of the radar.
He was miles, hundreds, thousands of miles out of the range of any Western radar. The Russians had radar and the Russians saw them, but they used their radar for another purpose.
That purpose was defense. The Soviets diligently monitored each and every airplane that flew into its restricted airspace. Russian journalist Andrei Ilyich believes that a manned American radar station had seen KAL-007 veer off course early on, but did not pass the information along.
The radar controller's voice is constantly recorded, and one said to the other, "Contact them, who knows where the hell they're going?" The researcher came to the point where they told him this has been erased, and that's that. And that's all bull, because the next morning the President of the United States announces the Soviet Union as an evil empire. This was pretty well prepared, and in that case nobody would have been erasing anything. This is all military deceit.
In fact, the evil empire line had come 5 months earlier, and there is no concrete evidence to indicate that anyone in America knew about the plane having strayed into Soviet territory. While US radar did track the aircraft as long as it remained in range, that information was recorded but not actively monitored.
And during that time, it did show the gradual deviation north of the intended track. However, at that time, there were no procedures in place for a person to monitor the radar to watch for such a deviation.
But there's no evidence, and never has been, to suggest that any civil radar, that any air traffic controller would have been looking at on that night had the capability to warn KAL-007 that it was proceeding off course.
And it wasn't just a radar problem. Several other events contributed to the tragedy. There were other planes in the immediate area that evening. Another Korean Airlines flight. And 120 kilometers away, an American spy plane. This plane, an RC-135, was monitoring secret Soviet missile tests. The RC-135 is a converted Boeing 707, which has a similar shape to a 747. These American spy planes flew in and out of Soviet airspace, intercepting communications and collecting data.
The Soviets knew all about these kinds of missions because they were routine, they'd been flown many times, and Soviet pilots had scrambled to actually chase down and often wave to some of these aircraft.
Passenger airlines had been warned that intrusion into Soviet territory could result in a possible attack.
The whole area was militarized, so to have an airliner coming across this area, even by accident, set them up for this disaster.
And because of the cat and mouse game being played between America and the USSR, the danger was particularly high.
It was common practice in those days for the U.S. To use RC-135s to tease the Soviets, mocking that they were going to penetrate their territory. They would fly toward their territory, and the Soviets would bring up their radars and send up fighters, and then the RC-135s would turn around.
As KAL-007 neared Soviet airspace, its flight path began to converge with that of the RC-135.
The Soviets were watching the aircraft on their radar, and different radar controllers in different locations were reporting position points to a central area, and someone in that central command was plotting these positions on a map. Someone made an error in reporting these coordinates or reporting the numbers, and when they plotted it, they showed that the two aircraft had in fact moved into the same area, in fact had merged and then separated.
Did the Soviets confuse the two airplanes and target the wrong one? Could anyone familiar with aviation mistake a Boeing 747 for a 707?
There are numerous superficial similarities in that they're both large, swept-wing, four-engine, low-wing jet transports. Both airplanes were just unpainted natural aluminum on the bottom of the wings and the bottom of the fuselage, so the coloration would be similar.
If the Soviet fighter planes approached the suspicious aircraft from behind and below, they would have seen an outline similar to a 707's, and a 707 converted into an RC-135 was what they were expecting to find. In order to clearly identify the plane, the fighter pilot would have had to approach it from the side, allowing him to see the distinctive hump of the 747.
Do we have any indication that the Russian fighter pilot did that?
In the case of the shoot-down, he transmitted back to his controllers several interesting pieces of information, but nothing that lets us know for sure that he had identified it as an airliner or a 747.
Retired Soviet Army General Anatoly Kornikov was the chief commander of air defense for Sakhalin Island.
We discovered an unidentified plane heading towards Sakhalin. Radars were activated and interceptor pilots ready in their cockpits. Soon we could identify the plane. It was still far away. I immediately decided to launch interceptors on duty into the air.
Lieutenant Colonel Gennady Osipovich was one of the fighter pilots sent to intercept the intruder.
I took off, they gave me the course immediately northeast, because the plane was coming from the north, from Kamchatka. At first I didn't expect it to be a military flight, but then they told me to activate my weapons and aim them at this target.
General Kornikov says every effort was made to identify the aircraft.
We were making sure that the flashing navigation lights were on. The pilot said yes, the flashing lights are working.
A flashing light indicates that a plane is carrying civilian passengers, but apparently this did not convince the Soviet general.
Judging by the shadow and configuration, he said it looked like an RC-135. I reported that I was ready to fire. No, they said, wait, don't shoot, don't fire your missiles. Approach his altitude and force the plane to land. In other words, they really didn't want to destroy it. I approached its altitude about 10,200 meters with readiness, and I started to flash my warning lights. This is a well-known international signal. You are in violation. I did it again, but again he didn't answer. I reported that he wasn't reacting. They told me, fire warning shots from your cannons. I moved even closer to it and shot first in a direction like this, parallel to its flight path. I fired about 4 rounds of warning shots and turned a little and fired another shot, and again there was absolutely no reaction and no transmission from it.
The Soviets had to make a decision. The Boeing 747 was nearing Sakhalin Island, home to 6 military airfields and the gateway to the Pacific Ocean for the Soviet fleet.
The plane was already approaching the island west coast. When I reported that the plane is absolutely not reacting and it's flying over our base, they gave me the order to destroy the plane.
The crew of KAL 007 were oblivious. What happened during the last dreadful moments of the flight? Did the Soviets cover up their part in the tragedy? Did the Su-15 fighter pilot warn the Korean 747 before firing his missiles? And where was the plane when it was hit? Over Soviet territory or in international waters? The fate of Korean Airlines Flight 007 was sealed once it strayed into Soviet airspace. But what actually took place in those last few crucial moments? As a Soviet fighter closed in on KAL 007, Korean passenger plane made an unexpected move. It began to climb from 10,000 meters to 10,700 meters. To the Soviet Su-15 pilot, the aeroplane appeared to be taking evasive action.
Right at that moment, something changed. No time for reasoned analysis about why that change might have happened. It's just noticing that, oh no, it's not maintaining a stable flight path at all.
He's seen me and he's pulling a trick.
The Soviet fighter pilot, Gennady Osipovich, got into position and fired his 2 missiles.
The left rocket is heat-seeking through infrared, and the right rocket is radar-guided. I didn't see the impact of the heat-seeking one, but the radar-guided I saw. Because you shoot it, and then you have to aim it by sighting it with beam, so it does not go off and self-destruct. I saw it explode right under the tail, near the stabilizer. I reported that the target was destroyed and returned to my airbase.
Did both Soviet missiles strike the 747? It's not known.
Right after impact, you can see that the nose begins to pitch up, airplane starts a climb. At the same time, the crew is making very large inputs of the control wheel to try to oppose this, and it's not being very effective. Well, pitch control all comes from the tail. So since there was an excursion in pitch, we can be fairly confident that something happened to the tail.
The cockpit voice recorder chronicled the flight crew's reaction.
That's on the voice recorder. Someone says, "What's that?" The airplane begins to pitch up.
Nose down. Okay, you're nosing back over.
We should be losing the hydraulics about now.
The missile or missiles had destroyed the hydraulic controls, the plane's nervous system. We know that the engines were still operating normally from the flight recorder.
The only change is this point here where the pilot himself reduced power in an effort to control this climb. We also have a verbal comment that was recorded by the cockpit voice recorder in which the flight engineer or the second officer advised the captain after the missile strike that all 4 engines were normal.
Looking back here, we can imagine what they couldn't see or never knew. The tail is scrap metal. An extra drag in the tail is jerking the tail back, pulling the nose up. Meantime, with all the scrap back there and the damage, the hydraulic lines going through the tail are all now bleeding. We're about to lose all 4 of our hydraulic systems.
All the hydraulic fluid to be lost, and if that happens, the airplane's pretty much uncontrolled.
A minute later, the cockpit recording stops.
I don't think that the concept of an attack would have ever occurred to him. I don't think they lived long enough to really think it through and even grasp the idea that they might have been hit by a missile.
But 10 minutes passed before the passenger jet struck the water at over 1,100 kilometers per hour. All 269 people on board were killed. Korean Airlines Flight 007 was totally destroyed. Osipovich insists he fired several warning shots at the jetliner. But did the fighter pilot know that he was tracking a passenger plane?
First of all, I didn't have time to figure out what kind of plane it was. I was the only one in the cockpit, and a plane is not a car. For one person to navigate, to aim weapons, to observe everything, and at the same time figure out if it is a civilian plane or whether it is waving at me friendly. I had only one goal. I was basically aiming, how to say, to kill. This is what I learned.
Osipovich was following orders, as he had been trained to do. But whether he followed recognized international procedures is a matter of debate.
The international accepted procedure is for the fighters to come up alongside, make visual contact with the crew, to alert them by either flashing their lights or firing cannons. The fighters that were sent up to intercept Korean Air did not follow the international procedures for interception and identification.
This is the actual audio recording of the radio conversation between Osipovich and his commanding officer in the minutes leading up to the firing of his missiles.
I flashed warning lights, meaning you are trespassing. I shot 4 rounds, more than 250 shells from cannons. We have more than 500. I didn't see the shells. They had to see the flashes from the barrel. They're big at night. Everyone could see it. We used all possible means to let them know they were trespassing. Commands from the ground, from the air, by blinking lights, by warning shots from the cannons.
But if so, why didn't KAL-007 see the warning shots? It's possible that the Korean plane had started its climb to 10,700 meters just before Osipovich fired. The warning shots could have passed beneath the 747, out of the Korean crew's line of sight. And another mystery remains. Where exactly was the Korean plane when it was attacked? The Soviets claimed that the incident occurred in their airspace, but some insist KAL-007 had re-entered international airspace.
This is a detailed map of the search areas. Where was the plane found?
Right here, X marks the spot where the wreckage was located. It's interesting to note that if you trace the 12-mile limit around Monaran Island and the 12-mile limit off the west coast of Sakhalin, it is definitely in international waters.
The report from the first investigation by the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, was released in 1984. It was inconclusive. 2 crucial pieces of evidence were missing: the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorders, the so-called black boxes.
The cockpit voice recorder does just what the name implies. It records all the sounds and all the voices that occur on the flight deck so that investigators can listen in and hear what's going on.
Not until 1992, 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, did Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, allow access to KAL-007's black boxes.
The flight data recorder was missing for almost 10 years. Finally turned over to ICAO in 1992, when we were able to see these traces right here and all the rest of the data on the flight data recorder Finally, for the first time, we could have a much better idea of exactly what happened aboard Korean Air 007 that night.
To confirm where KAL-007 fell into the sea, our experts employed a state-of-the-art search and rescue program called SARMAP. Software designer Owen Howlett and oceanographer Malcolm Spaulding worked backwards, calculating where the jumbo jet hit the water from information about the debris. Both tides and currents cause items in the water to move in predictable ways.
We have some indication about where the debris was found and roughly the time period that it occurred. And so let's say that the debris was being picked up along the shore in the southeast area of Akito Island in Japan. And so what we're looking for is actually where that path intersects with the flight path. Where we see these particles now intersect with the green line, which is K007's flight path, we would say that's probably the origin or the location of where the wreck site could be found.
After tracking the currents back to the crash site, Howlett and Spaulding confirmed their results by following the debris forward again.
Now that we have information about the actual wreck site, we've essentially overlaid where the wreck was found by the green airplane symbol that says wreck found, and we've overlaid on that as well the location of where we thought the search area should have been located for the debris field that we saw. See that the location of the wreck is to the south and west slightly of where the missile attack occurred, which seems consistent with the flight path and subsequent airplane motion after the attack occurred.
The wreckage was found by the divers here, which is approximately 38 kilometers, or that's about 20 nautical miles from Sakhalin Island.
Then that indicates that the wreckage was located just outside the 12-mile limit of territorial waters of Soviet Union.
That's right, Ron. It looks like it was about 14 nautical miles offshore.
This confirms where the Korean plane hit the water, but it doesn't betray where the Soviet fighter attacked its target. Did the deadly missile strike the jumbo jet over neutral or Soviet territory? Russian aviation investigators Vladimir Kofman and Yuri Chigorov were part of the original International Civil Aviation Organization team in 1983.
Presented here are the results of the decoding of the black box recording from plane KAL-007. The decoding was conducted in 1983. Because we did not have proper equipment, the decoding was done manually.
Based on data from Soviet radar, KAL-007 did not plunge straight down after being struck by the missile. Instead, it went into a long, wide spiral.
Here, on this graph, we see the plane's movements after it was hit. Here is the downward spiral with loss of altitude and speed. With the spiral descent, the plane's fuselage skin started disintegrating. The debris was dispersed over the 5 to 7 kilometer radius.
In fact, very little debris was ever found. The Soviets cited this fact as evidence that KAL-007 was a spy plane. To this day, General Kornakov is skeptical that the 747 was a civilian aircraft.
I'm still convinced there were no passengers on that plane, and I have grounds to think so.
No intact bodies were recovered from the crash site. This fueled countercharges that the Soviets had captured the passengers and were holding them prisoner. Where were the remains? Submarine Captain Mikhail Gears piloted one of the submersibles involved in the recovery.
We were actually looking for the Boeing, or what was left of it, and our main task was to recover the black boxes.
Once the Soviets found the black boxes, they wanted to determine if there had been passengers aboard the alleged spy plane. Only fragments of 4 human bodies, including a child, were ever recovered.
We found bones and body parts. You've seen my pictures. There were many underwater creatures that immediately eat everything, including crabs, and there was a strong current there. For a month, at a depth of over 200 meters, they were trying to fetch human remains from underneath a heap of plane debris. The remains were taken to the seashore, and doctors tried putting body parts together to determine how many people there were.
Identifying the remains was impossible. In fact, authorities were unable to prove conclusively that the body parts had even come from passengers of KAL 007.
There were very few remains from the crash of Korean Airlines 007, and we now know that the Soviet ships had actually found the wreckage, and they did not either salvage the cargo or find ways to give back to the families anything of the possessions or the bodies of the passengers. There is speculation that any remains that were either recovered from the wreckage or that washed on shore were destroyed by the Soviets because they did not want evidence of what they had discovered.
So what had happened to the bodies? How could they have vanished? Some experts believe that the aeroplane and its passengers were obliterated upon impact.
If the wreckage is seriously torn apart and just in small pieces, we'd have to assume that it had a lot of airspeed and a lot of impact when it hit the water. Conversely, if the fuselage and other parts of the airplane are largely intact, then you'd have to assume a lesser impact, but still enough to kill everybody on the airplane.
KAL 007 certainly could have disintegrated upon crashing into the ocean, the same way many planes do when they crash into the ground. Still, many relatives of the victims felt that the lack of remains indicated that there must have been survivors.
There are still some family members who would like to believe that their loved one is alive, even if they're being held hostage in a prison in Siberia. The fact that there were very few personal effects that were found means that there is no closure for the family members. They had no memorabilia of their loved one that they could bury and have a place to go grieve over.
In 1993, Russian journalist Andrei Ilyich organized a second dive to the crash site to search for clues. He invited Mikhail Gears to help with the investigation.
The main question still engendering myths is why no corpses were found. The task was to raise numbered parts of the plane and dissipate the ridiculous theories that this was the wrong plane and the Russians were hiding something. I retrieved the numbered parts so that we could send them to Boeing in Seattle and prove that they belong to that specific plane.
Ilyich personally retrieved several items from the seabed. He says these prove there were no survivors, that KAL 007 disintegrated.
This is inflatable life jacket. You can see that it belonged to Korean Airlines. The passenger apparently didn't have time to put it on. It all happened very fast. We brought this up from the bottom during our expedition. It was held down by big metal parts, otherwise it would have floated up and been carried away by the current.
Do swift currents, scavengers, and time account for the surprising scarcity of crash debris and human remains? And there's still the question of whether Soviet missiles connected with the Korean passenger plane. Had KAL 007 already passed into neutral and supposedly safe airspace? Or was it over Sakhalin Island and its top-secret military bases? And if the former, why did the USSR withhold the black boxes from international investigators for nearly 10 years? For almost 10 years, the shooting down of Korean Air Flight 007 was shrouded in mystery. Finally, in 1992, the Russian Federation relinquished the plane's black boxes to Korean authorities. A second official investigation, released in May of 1993, concluded that the Soviet Defense Forces had exercised proper conduct and made every attempt to identify and warn the passenger plane before firing on it. The report also concluded that the fighter pilot had attacked the 747 in Soviet airspace. Jim Oberg, an expert on Soviet disasters, disagrees. Oberg noticed that on page 10 of the 1993 report, the exact coordinates of where the plane was struck by the missiles were listed, as was the time and how far off course the 747 had flown. According to the ICAO report, the target was hit at 6:25 p.m. At the time, KAL 007 was 350 nautical miles to the right of airway R20. The coordinates of the location are 46 degrees north and 141 degrees east.
The most precise data was from the Russian tracking data itself, and in a supplement to the report in '93, the Russian government and the military provided tracking data which unambiguously showed the aircraft out past the 12-mile limit.
Are you telling me that Korean Airlines Flight 007 was shot down outside of Soviet airspace?
By a few miles, not by much, but clearly past it in international waters when the missile was launched. It had already crossed the 12-mile limit back into international waters where it was destroyed.
These incriminating coordinates come from the Russians themselves.
The reconstruction of the trajectory using the black box data and computer modeling still gave a little uncertainty of a few miles. But it's the Russian data from their own radar sites and numeric values of the position that they gave in 1992 that, when plotted on a map, show where it was attacked.
Even so, was there any reasonable justification for the attack?
The Soviet interceptors did not follow the international standards for intercepting aircraft that might be hostile over a country's own airspace. Those standards require that if there is a concern about an airplane being over your country's airspace and not being identified, that the interceptors are to go up and flash lights, waggle their wings, try to make radio contact, to try to do something to get the attention of the intercepted airplane.
Nobody can suggest, believably, that the Russians, the Soviets, were justified in doing what they did to KL-007 in 1983. Because, among other things, it presented no clear threat to them. It had already transited all their airspace it was going to transit. In fact, when they attacked it, it had already exited their airspace and was back out in international airspace, proceeding on toward Japan.
I don't believe the attack was justified because the fighter really didn't try to follow the standard procedures to identify this aircraft and warn it. If it had gone up close enough to get next to it and alert the pilots, he certainly should have been able to identify it as a civil aircraft.
The attack was absolutely not justified because the procedures required by international law for an unidentified aircraft involve identification procedures. Getting the attention of the pilot, giving them a chance to respond, to follow you to an airfield. Those steps the Soviets said they took, and they lied.
We had no choice. We had to destroy the Boeing, passengers or no passengers, and this is a big question. I mean, anybody could have been flying this plane.
There is past history where the governments who accept responsibility for causing death or injury, we still believe it's important for the Soviet Union or Russia now to do the same thing for the families of the people that were shot down.
The last flight of Korean Airlines 007 will always provoke controversy, even though the Cold War is long over. The official finding of the International Civil Aviation Organization remains that the Korean aeroplane flew off course due to pilot error, and that the Soviets truly believed that it was a spy plane.
The order to destroy was made in absolute conviction and was executed on this basis that this was a spy plane, which intruded very deeply, about 500 miles into the territory of a sovereign state.
But many experts remain unconvinced.
It's at night, it was running with lights, it was maintaining a straight and level course. The transponder, which the Russians would have been able to read with their radar, was operating, the rotating beacons were operating, and this is just not consistent with an RC-135.
It's possible that the truth lies somewhere in between. Korean Air Flight 007 ended tragically because of a series of errors, not just one.
The Soviets truly believed that this was a spy plane right up until ordering the shoot-down. They certainly would not have ordered the shoot-down of a civil aircraft if they knew it was.
To understand how these decisions were made, you must imagine the rampant paranoia. The pilot said it could be a civilian plane. Any serviceman should have understood. His job was not to analyze, but to report what he saw. No one's hands are clean in this story. No one is wearing a spotless shirt. Everybody used this tragedy for their own gain. There's no justice in this story, nor decent side. Everybody, the American side, the Korean side, and the Russian sides, all are somewhat guilty.